I do work on humanitarian emergencies, and I do work on displaced populations and how international law is used to allocate identities and how that allocation is increasingly structured through digital tools, artificial intelligence, deep learning, super platforms, etc., etc. So in 2020, the crisis and this idea of emergency came home. So a lot of you have probably studied the refugee crisis 2015, which created a series of pop-up humanitarian spaces throughout Europe. In comparison, it appears that COVID-19 has created a health crisis that amounts to a series of regional humanitarian spaces. Sometimes it's unclear whether it's the pandemic itself or the government interventions to control and suppress the pandemic, which is hitting the populations the hardest. And I'm particularly preoccupied by how the politics of no excess mortality also has its own dynamics and costs. Me personally, as a form of rapid academic practice, I've been taking my work and my research home to Norway and Europe this year, writing, blogging, speaking, and moderating interventions of COVID-19 and rule of law, in particular children's constitutional rights, minority health rights, women's rights, and this fascinating tracing app, Smittestop, which I'll get to at the end of this talk. Increasingly, I've also become interested in and preoccupied by the ethics of vaccine distribution. And I think that that's probably going to take up a lot of my focus over the next year as well. So it's, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, it was said that we were all in the same boat. So clearly we are not in the same boat, but we are in the same waters, and there aren't any other waters. So my main proposition for this talk is that we, as in us in the world, can and must see 2020 as something useful. But for us to do so, to follow the same map, we need to make sense of the landscape that this pandemic has created. So in terms of thinking conceptually about COVID-19, I've been greatly inspired by Craig Calhoun's idea of a crisis as a series of cultural constructs and framings of the humanitarian, of emergency, of urgency, and how these shape understandings of what happens in the world, who is supposed to act, what is supposed to be done, and what type of timeline, cost, and research investment involved is acceptable and intelligible. We can also think about the pandemic as what Veena Das has called a critical event, which describes events that are transformative in the making of society, bringing about new modes of action and new categories of understanding. So these are well-established sociological and anthropological insights about crisis. And in addition, we've had a number of contributions by public intellectuals this year, trying to make sense of the pandemic, explaining it both as a gateway and as a moment of change. So author and activist Arundhati Roy talks about the pandemic as a portal of opportunity between one world and the next. And Anthony Giddens argues that COVID-19 is a digidemic, where the digital transformation is radically transforming global health, politics, culture, and work-life relationships. So in this talk, I'm going to reflect on what COVID-19 does to the struggle for social justice and human rights. So how is this pandemic both a cultural construct in the shape of a digidemic, a critical event, and a portal? So my scope is kind of loosely global. What I try to do is to set out an analytical map, and to illustrate, I draw on my own work, actually examples from my own work this year. If you hear something squeaking, it's not a mouse, it's my chair. I'm realizing that every time I move, it makes an odd noise. Anyhow, so the first part of the talk, it looks at how this pandemic has impacted existing human rights struggles and also engendered a set of new struggles. And it put forward the argument that the pandemic also is a catalyst for accelerating the digital transformation that we're already in, and that this digital transformation also kind of shapes how we understand the pandemic. The second part does some forecasting about what next year and the year after is going to look like in terms of how we understand marginalization, exclusion, and justice, and looking at particularly the role of digital bodies and this new understanding of marginalization and injustice, and then thinking a little bit about tracing and distancing as specific strategies in this pandemic. And the third and final part has 2 case studies where I will think a little bit with you, and I'd love to get your input on this. Some lessons from digital remote education. So in Norway, we say that we have done dugnad. We've all sort of volunteered to stay home, abstain from social life, adhere to government rules, contribute to the common good through this dugnad. Children everywhere has done double dugnad. They've had to obey the rules, and it has had disproportionate impact on children. So at the same time, there's been an enormous focus on digital tools and remote learning that has happened globally this year. So I'm concerned about this. And I'd like to speak about how rights-based approaches to technology should be a part of how we understand this. And then finally, I have to say on a personal level, this Norwegian tracing app, Smittestopp, the rise and fall of this app and the tech community sort of fighting against the app. That's been sort of my pet joy of this year. It's been fascinating to see sort of the Norwegian tech sector go loggerheads with the FHI and Simula and the government and contesting the acceptability of this app, which was finally killed off. But I think it has some examples about digital activism and some thinking about how governments respond to this kind of criticism that is useful for how we think about future strategies to enhance social justice and to make sure that human rights are respected. And then finally, I'll be circling back to this notion of the pandemic as a moment of change, pain, struggle, and opportunity. So first, as a factor greatly impacting on existing human rights struggles, what can we observe looking back at this year from February until now in early December? So in human rights language, we would say that the state is responsible for respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights. And most certainly what governments have done and not done, and the effects of interventions have had very significant impacts on human rights globally. So I'll just mention 3 examples. So at the start of the pandemic, many places, jurisdictions were characterized by what I would call legal distancing, not social distancing, but legal distancing, which greatly further entrenched the marginalization and exclusion of vulnerable population, and in particular, actually migrants. So what happened was something that happened with the opposing cycles of speed. So there was great regulatory haste on one hand. Country after country had to find some legal basis for their lockdown rules, legal basis for not doing courts, legal basis for not giving people access to lawyers, legal access for keeping people in detention, for not doing asylum interviews, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, there was an institutional slowdown of due process mechanisms and bureaucratic processing on the other hand. So the legal distancing was and is continually a challenge to the rule of law. Of course, domestic violence in a disaster, we know from previous research that disasters, man-made or natural emergencies, lead to surges in intimate partner violence. In the case of COVID-19, this has been described as a pandemic within a pandemic. So many victims have been trapped with their abusers, the added frustration of job insecurity, the inability to socialize, restrictions of movements, different burdens of dealing with housework, work, and homeschooling at the same time. At the same time, cruelly, the nature of the pandemic has meant that access to shelters, healthcare, counseling is even more precarious than usual. So that's one very serious concern from 2020, what happened with domestic violence. And then there's the question of the failure to fulfill the right to health. So what are the state's human rights obligations with respect to ensuring that health information is accessible in a non-discriminatory manner. I'm wondering if Professor Anne Hellum is here. She's been really a leader in this work that we've done together. Early on, a lot of countries, cases from Sweden, the UK, the US, Norway, and many others, showed significant challenges in government's reach with respect to offering inclusive and effective health information to minorities. Many places, including Norway, it's turned out that the minority and immigrant perspective has been completely absent in preparedness planning, and also that health communication has been inadequate. So this has been actually a challenging issue, and it continues to be difficult. At the same time, the positive outcome is that we're getting this discussion sort of playing out very loudly and visibly in many, many jurisdictions at the moment. So we also have a couple of new struggles that threaten, that are interesting from a social justice perspective, but also touches on a lot of human rights issues. So I'll just mention two. The first is the children's rights and lockdowns. The Children's Rights Convention is the world's most ratified human rights convention. But as illustrated by the global wave of lockdowns this spring, most countries were incredibly fast to lock down schools without any sort of trade-off or balanced assessment of how this would impact children, without considering the best interest of the child according to Article 3, without hearing children, without assessing carefully enough, in my view, their likelihood for being vectors for infection, for example. The long-term implications are tremendous. Save the Children reports that more than 1.6 billion learners globally have faced school closures due to the pandemic, and that this disruption will result in at least 10 million children never returning to school. A second type of struggle revolves around administrative detention. I'm not only thinking about sort of detention center for migrants, but also prisons, nursing homes. The Norwegians have something called the Corona Hotel, where you have to check in if you are infected or if you are in quarantine. So there's this question of administrative detention and who ends up in administrative detention and the kind of conditions in these facilities. And then the third one, which I think is fascinating and important, and I think we don't really see the contours of this clearly yet, and that concerns vaccine coverage and the consequences for the ability to provide for populations, including other healthcare challenges. So the world has greatly welcomed the news over the last couple of weeks that vaccines now seem to be ready for the rollout. Moderna, AstraZeneca, Pfizer. So approximately 200 more vaccines are actually in the pipeline, and 48 are in clinical and 164 in preclinical stages of development. So, you know, we will get not only one vaccine, but many vaccines for COVID-19. And there are initiatives for making sure that these vaccines are also distributed to lower middle income countries. At the moment, a lot of the discussion is focused on access. But when these vaccine schemes have been successfully rolled out, how much of the domestic health budgets are they going to be allowed to eat up? I think it is to be expected that donor countries will require that countries receiving aid will invest a substantial amount of this in ensuring full vaccine coverage in their, you know, demographically much younger populations, literally to save the aging West. This is, I think, going to be an dilemma. So while vaccines might be subsidized, there will also be requirements that even very poor countries pay for this themselves. And what happens to other kinds of healthcare? Then there's the second point here, and that's this notion of the pandemic being a catalyst for an accelerated digital transformation. So a digital transformation is generally construed as the integration of ICTs within an organization, company, brand of government, and digital tools transform how the actor operates, delivers on its mission, and achieves more impact. It's either also part of how things we used to do in an analog way are now converted, articulated, and managed through digital tools. So I used to sort of go to the copy machine and copy per hand. Now I can scan. But it also includes the vast edification of governance through the conversion and articulation of information, concept, processes of systems in mathematical and machine readable formats, right? So it's a little bit like everything becomes this kind of technological cake recipe. I think this pandemic has been a shock to an ongoing process, yet more as an accelerator than as a game changer. So remote working, remote medicine, remote education, remote religious practice. The Norwegian Church has done quite well with this pandemic. Remote socializing, remote entertainment is really restructuring how we live, work, interact, and engage with the market and the state as individuals being governed and having to earn a wage, but also in terms of how we make use of services and acquire products and care for each other. So we don't know a lot about this yet, right? We're still in the middle of the storm. And interestingly and importantly, we know quite not enough, of course, at all about how spaces with less connectivity, lower levels of digital literacy, and more prevalence of digital shadows have fared in this scheme of sort of accelerated digital transformations. And of course, some of these areas also have not been very badly hit by the pandemic. So I think this is something that we're going to learn more from over the next years as research starts materializing. So the second point of my talk is about forecasting the post-COVID-19 world, what it's going to look like. I think it's going to be necessary to rethink our understanding of marginalization and violations. There's nothing new about governments tracing and distancing bodies in a fairly robust manner. We've always blamed people that have diseases. We've stigmatized. We've also stigmatized people who were already marginal in society. Think about HIV/AIDS, think about Ebola, think about previous pests and plagues. And I think this is also likely to be the legacy of this pandemic. But something else has happened here, and this is that the public health governing techniques deployed to counter COVID-19 have not only contributed to knowledge-based public health policy, but also to extraordinary individual legibility, extensive population surveillance, and of course, an unprecedented hoarding of personal and demographically identifiable information. And this has consequences, and that's what I want to get to here. So the digital transformation will also affect how we identify, understand, and address marginality in the future. So what's the legacy of things happening in 2020? How does the accumulation of data generate resources and power for the private sector, for example? And how does this restrict future pathways for governance? These are broad, open-ended questions, but I hope we can ask them, and I hope after a while we can ask them in an evidence-based manner. So the first thing here is that often when we think about the problem information gathering, we think about the individual, what about my personal data? What about me? Has there been good enough consent? Was it informed, et cetera, et cetera? For those of us doing research, we go through very labor-intensive processes with NSD to get permissions for the research we do, and then we try to make sure that we protect personal data in an adequate way. I think that in the context of COVID-19, we should probably give more attention also to the potential and pitfalls of collecting and using demographically identifiable information. So this is where individual and/or aggregated data points allow inferences to be drawn that enable the classification, identification, and/or tracking of names and unnamed individuals of certain groups, according to ethnicity, economic class, religion, gender, age, health condition, etc., etc. I know that this spring, Oslo kommune, the municipality here in Oslo, sent out specific text messages to people belonging to minority ethnic groups. And that seems to have been a process that both the municipality and that specific ethnic group was okay with. But at the same time, it's a fairly radical step in an open liberal democracy. And you can think about much less benign governance efforts. The role of digital bodies, I think, is also important. And this, those of you who read me knows that this is one of my pets. So digital bodies and how they are uncertain. So, you know, do look up the sociologist Deborah Lupton. She's a real trailblazer in the field of health sociology and digital sociology. And she's thinking about digital bodies, images, information, biometrics, and other types of digital data that represent the physical bodies of people or populations, but over which we, as individuals and groups, have little control and say over, whether it's digital bodies produced by states or by private sector actors or by international actors. So in recent years, we've globally seen this move towards construing online harm as real, and not only as a threat to my honor and reputation, but also to integrity, safety, and security, and livelihood. And I think that in the COVID-19 response, the fact of digital bodies as subjects of governance have acquired a new visibility. So I think the digital body is no longer just sort of a concept for specifically interested researchers like me. So digital tools, they of course work to carry out health interventions, but the capabilities and constrictions and limitations of this technology also mandate what restrictions and regulations look like, and consequently the parameters for their enforcement. So basically the technology makes up the policy as well. So it determines the type of pandemic surveillance possible, not only the other way around. So I think this it's an important moment to think about what this means for citizenship, human rights protection, and social justice. For all types of new technology, usually, I mean, you mentioned that I've been working on drones, so a lot of the focus, the critical focus, this discussion around drones has been on how it's very much presented with this air of of technological utopianism or optimism. So if we have a drone, if we have some kind of technology, it can enable us to effect fundamental change, really without getting stuck in politics or this messy business of struggling for social justice on a grassroots level. And part of the same technological determinism and utopianism has been surrounding a lot of interventions this year. The same with technological determinism. And these two are kind of key concepts in any critique of technological digital responses. So technological determinism, for better or worse, whether you fear technology or you love technology, is this idea that this tech works as expected, without malfunctioning, without structural design issues, without too many unexpected consequences. And both are, of course, fallacies, and we need to actively understand that. Then we need to pay attention to the many problems that have sort of arisen in the field, from hacking of technical tools by malicious actors to apps and platforms that are oversold and simply don't work, which is a problem, right? So if you invest in a platform that do not help you protect the population, that's wasted money and an unprotected population. And it's also been reported that a lot of these, when you try to go to a restaurant, either to eat or get a takeout, you have to register. So there's been examples of this data, sort of this micro tracing by private actors being used to harass women, for example. And I have to say, this proliferation of smaller infection tracing initiatives, it's my hunch is that it's regulated, but it's not checked for compliance. This seems like a bit of a home alone party with little oversight and little prospective remedy in terms of what happens with data. So in sum, this means that digital bodies are uncertain and in themselves potential sources of risk and harm. But also that at the moment, our digital bodies are constituted and reconstituted for future governance use. And we don't know what the legacy of this is going to be and what's going to happen. So I think if we can just conceptualize this idea that there is something called digital bodies and it's going to be important for how we think about the world, I think that's a good starting point for continuing to work. Then my third point here is about tracing and distancing as specific strategies. So I already talked about legal distancing and how that was marginalizing particular populations, such as refugees, asylum seekers, people waiting for resettlement. I've been doing a little bit of work on what happened to interviews of refugees. UNHCR was very quick to churn out policy guidance for how these things were going to be carried out. And then an interesting observation here is that particularly for resettlement, being considered vulnerable is important. And early policy documents advise against doing interviews with vulnerable refugees in their homes because they would either be put at risk by having to reveal things in front of their family that they were not comfortable revealing, or they would be manipulated. So this is interesting, right? So it seems like people who already are potentially vulnerable are left in an even tighter spot through this policy advice. I don't know that I have a better suggestion than warning off these kinds of interviews, but it is an interesting development. And the important thing here is that all of these initiatives, a growing list of restrictions, combined with these systems going to sleep, might be converted officially into temporary and measures that are then permanent measures across a broad swath of migration categories and administrative processes. So in Norway, for example, it seems like the refugee resettlement quota as such is now up for negotiation, and it's never been up for negotiation before. And then finally, in this section of the talk, I'm interested in what's going to happen with the vaccines. So once these vaccine schemes are in motion, it's not only governments which will be compelled to invest in them. I mean, we're going to be compelled to invest in them as well, right? With our trust, our goodwill, our bodies, our future health at stake. And of course, also, this is an enormous field of interest for private sector actors. So because effective vaccine coverage is required, and I understand this is going to be around 60–70% for COVID-19 vaccines, the tracing of vaccinated bodies is going to be a policy and governance priority. At the same time, it's going to be important to limit the mobility and interactions of those who have not taken the vaccines, either because they don't have access or because they do not want to take these vaccines. So here the politics of the digital body will get very visible. As I was writing up the manuscript this morning, I actually got an email from one of these tech listservs that I'm a member of saying, can you help the WHO develop digital COVID-19 vaccine certification standards? So the question is here, how digital yellow card certificates can help us track immunizations. And the implication here is, of course, that this will leverage and enhance ongoing digital identity system projects. So I think this is something we really, again, need to pay attention to. There's a global transformation here, which is going very fast and in many different directions. So what do we do with all of this? The final part of my talk is called Rethinking Strategies for Justice Making. I have two examples that I care about on a personal level. And the first one is as a, I have 3 children. We've been doing homeschooling. It was hard on us, but we are not in the same boat. In Norway, this was ending by late April or early May. Elsewhere, there are examples of children doing this for months and months and months. And as I said previously, the risk that 10 million children will never return to school. So here I'll draw on work that I'm doing with Professor Inge Nikdal. And we have a piece forthcoming in the Yale Journal of International Law on a potential digital fragmentation of the right to education. And my point here is that post-COVID-19, we need, as people who are doing research, but also as people who care about social justice and human rights, we need to be alert and do conceptual work to understand, resist, and criticize changes to the content of established rights. So increasingly, there's a sense in human rights scholarship, at least, that we need to take a rights-based approach to algorithms and the changes they engender. So this means developing frameworks for the design, development, and deployment of algorithms, and identifying factors that states and businesses should take into consideration. This is very important work, but it also means that we have to be keenly attuned to specific instances, specific moments in what I'll call the life cycle of digital bodies. And now I'll focus on children. So in the case of lockdowns, a lot of the problem framing, if you look at documents issued by Save the Children, by UNICEF, UNESCO, the World Bank, et cetera, the problem of the lockdown as a barrier to education and the proposed solution to overcoming this barrier has been, it's been sort of framing a remote learning and connectivity and access to hardware as the solution to the lockdown. So if you frame technology as key, you privilege certain understandings of how this right to education is violated and what are the solutions. And our argument is that this trend towards digital learning, it contributes to a platformization of education, and also engenders new problems with respect to discrimination and data protection, freedom of speech and thought, and the right to culture. Previously, UN treaty bodies have argued for a very comprehensive and holistic understanding of the right to education as more than sort of equal access to digital tools. And this comprehensive and holistic framing needs to be re-emphasized in the current context. So the first major criticism we have in terms of how this undermines children's rights. And again, this is just an example of how we can think about threats to the content of established rights. So we wonder about discrimination. So the rise of corporate and state-controlled platform ecosystems have led to this platformization of schoolings. For a lot of established actors, COVID-19 has been a business opportunity. And we already see moves towards privatizing education further. So selling edtech to students and parents, framing edtech as a type of humanitarian response, instead of thinking about inclusive access. The second one concerns data protection and privacy, and the role of data. So this is not only about delivering educational content to children, but also about improving learning management systems and monitoring tools to track student learning. So are we talking about education, or are we talking about digital surveillance with an educational content and component? And who's protecting the integrity of children's digital bodies here? I think this is, we all have, read about these cases of learning robots that can enable children who can't be in the classroom in kind of normal circumstances to participate along with their classmates. But these other classmates have the right not to be under continuous tracking and surveillance. And the final one is about, the values of public education here and the integrity of, for example, national or minority or indigenous educational systems. So platformization means that, and particularly where platforms have this stated goal of transforming cultures of education through technology. Technology is neutral. Technology restructures the content of education by providing a specific digital infrastructure. In adaptive learning system, this can really undermine or reshape what we call curricular values, or just really flatten contextual approaches to education. And in a way, you know, and I see this as a teacher myself, in a way, you know, student data becomes interchangeable with students. Did you tick this box? Did you fill in here? What's been your sort of level of activities? How can we measure logins? So there's this point of a greater scrutiny of technology platforms in the classroom. And then my final question, a final issue, concerns the challenges of organizing and doing activism post COVID-19. So just for those of you who don't know, in April, the Norwegian tracking app Smittestopp was launched. The Prime Minister said to everyone that, you know, if you want your life back, you have to download this app. This app was part of a global and rapidly expanding ecosystem of tracking apps. Some of them more successful than others, but the legacy of these apps created in a haste and with dubious procurement practices and problematic regulation of the tech is largely, I'd say, non-impressive. So in the Norwegian context, it was finally over by September 28th. This has been, for Norwegian standards, a fairly sort of vicious and mudslinging affair, but also quite entertaining, to be honest. I'm not so interested in the surveillance implications here or the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of this app. But I'm interested in watching or thinking about this as an experiment that tells us about the digital transformation of governance and efforts to govern at the national level. So in a way, Norway is a bad case, right? But Norway is also a good case. Smittestopp was a fantastic fiasco, but it was also kind of a surprising fiasco. Norway is wealthy, consensus-oriented, very digitized, very rapid adopters of technology. But the passion with which activists, technologists, bureaucrats, and scholars fought against this app, makes me think that for the rule of law and democratic accountability, struggles over personal data and privacy will continue to get fiercer. Struggles over the integrity of the digital body, if you wish. So Smittestopp was criticized for everything, from long before it was launched, from being badly designed, consuming energy, from being a technological disaster, for the procurement process, for the bad public communication, and eventually for being illegal. It was interesting, and also because data sovereignty hasn't really made it onto the Norwegian national political agenda yet. But some observations. So data protection and privacy discourses have become the staple of powerful political rhetoric. And as I said, imaginaries of these digital bodies as vulnerable and in need of protection are increasingly prevalent in public discourse. And also, I'm also observing that in Norway, as well as in many other places, this notion of compliance with the GDPR, it functions not only sort of as a legal corrective, but also almost as an assertion of righteousness or a lack of righteousness. So the compliance with GDPR has kind of become a moral frame as well. So the thing with Smittestopp is that it raises questions about the kind of methods and competency challenges that civil society and academia is facing. So activists, technologists, bureaucrats, and scholars fought against the app. Established Norwegian civil society either welcomed the app or said nothing. I think in particular that the Norwegian human rights community has been very disappointing. Generally disappointing this year, to be frank. Human rights problems seems to be something that happens in other countries. There's been almost a studied disinterest in seeing the Norwegian context as worthy of attention and worthy of criticism. We can discuss this in a different form, but there's something that should worry us here. Similarly, at some point, I looked at Sweden and Human Rights Watch Sweden, in the middle of a massive death rate this spring, was occupied by hosting seminars about COVID-19 impact on vulnerable populations elsewhere. So there's something about the Nordics, I think. But what kind of competency do we need? First, I think we need to recognize what kind of problem this is. You know, we are a nation with a high trust in the state and the government. This time around, it didn't quite work. In other countries, they have foundations, data labs, nonprofits, or grassroots NGOs focusing on holding actors democratically accountable in the digital domain. In the Norwegian welfare state, we don't, right? So I think this is visible at the moment, where we have big debates about healthcare platform procurements, the NAV scandal, et cetera, but largely the voice of civil society is absent. And I just use strong words questioning their interest in this at all, but this might also have something to do with competence and what we know and what we don't know. So with Smittestopp, I identified 4 lines of contention, and that's going to be the end of my talk. So in the Norwegian rhetoric, there was this rise of blaming big tech, both as the bureaucratic and commercial explanation for failure. So according to this narrative, Smittestopp was going to be a success, but then it was undermined by Google and Apple. I think it's true that we need to regulate Google and Apple, but the lack of adequate regulation of transnational actors was not why this app failed. So, you know, in the 90s, everything was about globalization. Then we've been criticizing, you know, the placeholder has been neoliberal the last 2 decades. I'm concerned that blaming big tech is going to be the new placeholder. The second thing about Smittestopp, and what I like least about this, is that it's become part of this global normalization of attacks on human rights actors. So, you know, Norway, for those of you who don't know, we're a humanitarian superpower. But we also like to see ourselves as at the vanguard of human rights protection. I've said previously that the human rights sector has been very quiet here. But when international actors, Amnesty International to be precise, entered the ranks of Smittestopp critics in early June, real acrimony ensued. So Simula, which was the developer of Smittestopp, really got into sort of a dogfight. So Amnesty published a report internationally that the Norwegian Smittestopp app was the worst in the world, along with Kuwait and Bahrain. Simula described this report as absolute trash, stating that it was a report of an exceptionally low quality, that Amnesty was abusing their position and power, providing poorly documented conclusions, and behaving in an unprofessional manner. And interestingly enough, also letting itself be manipulated by activists, which is pretty entertaining if it wasn't serious. For Norwegian context, this is quite exceptional. For those of you who are interested, this exists on tape. One of my blog posts provides the link. After a while, the government, the Minister of Health, also blamed the Data Protection Agency for the Smittestopp fiasco. And eventually Smittestopp died because it was considered illegal. So our minister has said that, you know, this really set back the struggle against COVID-19 and that this agency hadn't done their job, et cetera, and now they didn't have access to valuable data. So the head of the DPA retorted that it was not a lack of advice, but things that the stakeholders themselves did to mess things up. And that by failing to be able to document utility of the app, you know, this wasn't working, and that the law applies also in times of national emergencies. The government and to a certain extent the tech partner has gone after individual critics and questioned their motives and presented them as dishonest. This is very difficult to defend against. Again, the Norwegian context is relatively benign, but it's problematic. So I think in the future, what kind of competency do we need? What kind of skills do we need to be effective critics and analysts? Data activists have used the Freedom of Information Act a lot to painstakingly map what the government, the health authorities, the DPA has done on Smittestopp. They're now focusing on getting access to code and to data sets. For most of us, this is difficult to understand, but I do think it's a fundamental part of future democratic practice. Right, so my conclusion, and I've spent all my time, which is sad. So I've been trying to make sense of 2020 from a justice and rights perspective. Everything is still up in the air. In a couple of months from now, this talk might look completely obsolete or not. But at least hopefully it's provided you, the audience, with some starting points for thinking about what has happened and where we go from here. Power and accumulation in the digitization of the state, of welfare, of citizenship, will determine pathways for the next decade. The pandemic has been literally a virtual global power and resource grab for those who already have a lot. It's going to be a new world out there, one that we never imagined would befall us in just a few months. However, despite of all this, the fight for something better must continue. We don't have other options. We need to end the pandemic and then move on. And I would like to end with a full quote of Arundhati Roy in her essay from April this year. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, of our data banks and dead ideals, or dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristin. Fantastic presentation, super rich, very shocking and enlightening at the same time. I think many of us feel that we've lived a lot of this. I'm sure everybody in at least taking part today feels that some kind of connection to what you've described and to what you've talked about. So this is been a very strong presentation indeed. We're very, very happy to have you here. I'm going to turn over, of course, to some questions from people. There are a few questions in chat, and I see fingers being wagged at me, like Paul Wisborg was wagging his finger, as he always does. Oh, I'm only joking. But I have a question before we start, just to kind of make sure that other people are also ready to have some questions as well. And that is, I mean, I think you place an emphasis on competency at the end, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think that, that competency, maybe it's not surprising that competency isn't there, given the complexity of what we're talking about and given also the speed of movement of what has occurred in terms of digital developments, in terms of technological developments. So that I think many feel that they're not hanging with it, that it's very hard to keep up with this. And that competency is not only lacking, in crucial circles, but it's just generally lacking amongst a wide, across the public as well. And certainly is lacking amongst politicians. And so I think that maybe one of the things that maybe you could talk to is, what is it that we need to do to make sure that politicians at least are better informed about this? I mean, I'm thinking about these meetings that were held, for example, between the CEO of Facebook and the American Congress where he had to make a statement where he clearly the people asking the questions don't know what they're asking about. They don't really understand at all. I'm sure myself, as a man who's now 50, would also find it difficult to be able to actually ask the right questions. I mean, I think it's a very hard thing to do. Connected to that, and just you ended as well with this quote from Roy, talking about a portal and about the experience of the past. I'm just wondering to what extent, I mean, if we think about what's occurred now in the course of this pandemic, whether there is a similar velocity, a similar trajectory to the transformations that were made in these earlier pandemics.
So if I can just give some brief feedback on that, I think, what we need to do as citizens, but also as academics and students. I mean, I think our job is to grapple with what's going on, right? So name things. I mean, to put label on things. So, from studying legal consciousness, we need to study the techno-legal consciousness. And then to a certain extent, it's also about organizing to get concepts recognized, right? I mean, you know about this as someone working in Colombia, but the struggle to get this recognized as a war and not a terrorist attack.
Yeah.
The struggle to have data recognized as a resource and a collective resource, and this notion of public good, for example. So I was just recently at the founding meeting of the non-aligned technological movement, tech movement, which is a movement working against data capitalism, data colonialism, the way that corporations are extracting the data of marginal populations who get nothing back except being subjected to double the amount of surveillance. So I think our job is to name and claim and maybe blame, to put it in social legal terms. And of course, many of us are not digitally competent enough. I mean, only a few. But I do think that, this pandemic is different because usually it's at a distance, right? But this pandemic has cost everywhere. And it's cost people their lives, their marriages, their jobs, their lives' work, their houses. And usually this is somewhere else. But now this is also across our world, wherever we are. In a way, sometimes I wonder if we are, and obviously I would don't mean to be offensive, but it's almost like we're at the end of the Second World War with that incredible transformation taking place. Unfortunately, then having the Cold War come up. But I think it's been exceptionally deep, the change we've been through this year.
Thanks, Kristin. Paul, would you like to come in here, ask a question?
John, I actually was only moving my iPad. I would like to come in, but I think maybe some of the students should go first, and you have the students' questions.
That's fine, we can. We have a series of comments, questions that came from students. So let me just, I think, go to the top of that list and actually ask the students to pose the question themselves. So Carmen, you had some comments and a question. Maybe you can sort of hone that down to something a little bit more summarized.
As typical of me, I talk a lot, but yes, well, my comment was in the beginning regarding the dugnad in Norway and in Oslo especially, and what I consider a very interesting, how can I say, phenomenon when the Black Lives Matters protest happened in front of the Stortinget, and the police didn't took any how is it called? I phrase myself better here, but they didn't make any regulations to help people keeping the distance. They just stand aside. And it was after the first very scary phase of the coronavirus. So I was part of that protest, and it was very difficult to keep the distance from people. So it was a very scary first confrontation after the first lockdown. But after that, it became the summer, and in the summer it was okay to just be in the beach, out in the beach, in a massive amount of people around you. So I don't know. It has been a process, a very confusing process. in Oslo, also regarding the app that you mentioned. And now it's like we are all the way back in the beginning. Now it's mandatory with the face mask. It has been a lot of controversies and many messages coming at the same time, a lot of parallel messages, a confusing time. So, but what I want to narrow down to you, my question is, where do you find the balance between protecting health from an unknown virus? We don't know, that's why it's novel. We don't know much about the virus, and the sense of loss of control of what we know and what we can prevent, and but at the same time, also protecting the rights of people that had been worked on since after the Second World War, freedom and etc. Where is the balance there?
I think that's the key question for this pandemic. And unfortunately, a couple of months ago, I find myself in frequent agreement with a certain president who has not an option for a second term. You know, I mean, and for my generation, you know, we've been fighting against the niqab, but now suddenly it's on with a face mask. Very odd culturally. But then my neighbor told me, she's Croatian, she told me to suck it up and put on my face mask. So I'm no longer complaining. I probably belong to the skeptics. I think that, I mean, the Norwegian response has been fine. We have oil money, you know, Norway is even more unreal than usual. I mean, we have less mortality than in an average year because Norwegians have started to wash their hands. So in terms of people dying of flu, it's just fewer. Maybe Norway isn't a good example, but I do think that the willingness to trample on children's rights, for example, the presentation of restrictions on people in institutions by local municipalities, you know, how they just lock down services, refuse people to get visits. And you know, they've argued that they would have, in the beginning of the pandemic, they argued that we don't want, you know, people from Oslo coming to their hytta, we want to protect our part of the country from the disease. But of course, in municipalities that are already badly governed, this has been used as an excuse to restrict services and to sort of go around democratic procedures in local governance, for example. But Norway isn't the worst example. And I have to say, we didn't let anyone die, as far as I'm concerned, due to ethnicity or where in the country they were. I mean, people have been rescued, it seems like, to the extent that it was possible. And I think this is important. You know, I complain and I criticize, but I also acknowledge that we have not had the type of abandonment that other countries have seen. And this is worth something, right? I mean, we can criticize Norway, but it should also be an example of what's possible. If you look at the death tolls other places, Sweden deregulated care homes, nursing homes in 1992, giving that responsibility to municipalities. Sweden has double the amount of the Norwegian population and has over more than 7,000 dead people. I mean, you know, it's shocking. Yes. Okay, next question.
Josefina?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about what you said about regulations, and now with fewer and fewer...
I can't hear anything.
Speak up a little bit.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I was thinking about what you said about regulations, and now with fewer and fewer hands owning more and more in the world, and with that also information, I was wondering what you think about the regulations of big companies, for example, Facebook, Google, and also with the use of Zoom and Teams and other apps in work and education when it comes to security, but also in the as a whole, what do you think will happen to ownership, power, and also policy making within this digital world?
Now we are sort of getting a little bit away from the pandemic, because these things were things that would have had to happen. I think an important legacy of the pandemic is that the resentment felt against China is finally being articulated, and it's resulting in a full-blown war on data between the US and China, visible with Huawei and TikTok, but I think this is going to continue. And again, you know, like, this is where you kind of find yourself in agreement with Donald. He's now sued Facebook. I mean, not for the right reasons, but I do think that, you know, there's going to be use of antitrust law to break up the tech giants. The European Union, and who used to be the enemy for people on the left, right? Now the European Union looks super progressive. Is proposing fairly radical and quite useful legislation to control data. And of course, the law is never managing to keep up, right? It's either lagging much behind, and it's partly because what we call the law of the horse problem. You know, you cannot have one law for big drones, one for small drones, one for yellow drones. You have to try to find some sort of law, legal regulation that's comprehensive. So you know, law can never do this work alone. But I do think that this is going to be global power struggles, specifically between the US and China, and there's going to be a breakup of particularly US actors. But from the US perspective, if they want to weaken their own domestic players and have a global trade war, I mean, that's also tension. But you know, largely this is a lot out of our hands.
Thank you. Ingrid?
Yes, you mentioned the AV1 robots, the ones sitting in the classrooms. So I know that they take a lot of precautions to keep privacy, and that it's only the children behind the iPad that can like look into the classroom. But I'm wondering if you think it's impossible to make something like that safe, or if it's like, yeah.
I mean, I think the extent of harm subjected to children and the lack of debate is incredible. So, I mean, I have 3 kids in school. They were all given sort of pads. When we tried to bring up the discussion about cybersecurity and digital literacy with the school, they got very angry. And other parents also. It's very uncomfortable to be that person. But I think when you look at sort of how vulnerable children are, and they use all kinds of programs under pads, although they've been told they can only use this and this and this, right? But particularly male children are extremely vulnerable to targeted exploitation and abuse, probably more so than girl children. So I think it's completely unsafe, to be honest. I think it's a big type of experiment on kids and everywhere. And it bothers me that engaging critically with this, for example, in the context of emergencies, then you're getting labeled as a spoiler. You know, you hate tech, you're so negative, you don't want to work on this. Look, we're giving these kids an education. But very often these actors are not asked to justify and do risk impact assessments, for example. So I think this is the way forward, but it needs to be done properly.
Ashley?
Yeah. I think first, just a little anecdote about drones and being at the Black Lives, I'm in New York, and being at the Black Lives Matter protests here, and having been at lots of protests over years. And back in June, sort of the first weekend that we were out, realizing that there were police drones flying for the first time, that I'd been out and seen that. Yeah. And I don't think it's because the NYPD was taking COVID precautions, not their what they're known for. But then my question was about if this is ultimately going to be a choice between privacy and health, and then sort of more specifically, if that's going to be presented as a choice between our personal privacy and our neighbor or our community's health.
I mean, I think it's already. I mean, with this pandemic, you know, this idea of the moral stigma of people who don't want to do this and this and this and this, download, people who don't want to register. I mean, I think we're already there. You know, to a certain extent, I mean, what's happened with mobility in this pandemic is interesting, right? So it's gone from mobility is the engine of integration of economic development, and now, you know, lack of mobility is the engine of economic development, right? So now you have to stay put, and if you move, that's stigmatized. So it's weird, and so I think if we want to go back to the world we had, I don't think that world exists. I think that we're going to have to engage in other ways as citizens. I think privacy is something that a lot of the privacy as we thought about it a decade ago probably doesn't exist. But I also think that we can argue for new robust rights, civil rights as citizens, you know, to be protected, to have rights, to have remedy, to be respected. So that police drone, right? You know, we know that the facial recognition tools are not perfect. You know, they might misidentify, they might inappropriately connect that footage to other types of footage, but probably more for certain populations than others. So I think those are the things we need to fight against. You know, increasingly crimes are also digital. Huh? But I mean, I think it's a tremendously interesting and difficult field to navigate in at present. But again, I think that COVID-19 has been a game changer in terms of how we deal with these things.
Paul, do you want to come in here?
Okay, thanks, Kristin. Thanks for an amazing talk, very, very rich and stimulating. I think, I mean, you're really, really important on what you say about the human rights and civil society and general citizen awareness and sort of weak awareness in terms of monitoring and protesting against very, very drastic measures by governments. I think in Norway, you know, Professor Grava was almost like a lonely voice asking questions about the emergency measures when they were initially introduced by the Norwegian government. Just a couple of examples that I had in mind. You know, I saw recently that the British test and trace program, which has cost more than the whole police and fire services in the UK this year. They've spent that much funding on it, and as I understand, a lot of it has been going to private sector, but it was related to a sort of a sense of a strong urgency of the UK government in being a success on this. And then just recently, when the Pfizer medicine or vaccine was approved in UK, a minister was sort of boasting, okay, we did this in a week because we have a more efficient regulatory system than the European Union, and seemingly again under some kind of pressure to perform or to have some kind of victories or demonstrate action. That kind of sort of climate of fear and pressure affecting politicians and leaders seems to be something that we really need to sort of be aware of and question and test, and for instance in relation to the impact of children as you are mentioning. But do you have some more thoughts about that general atmosphere and its effects on politicians and governance and some of these dramatic decisions and measures taken, not because they don't need to be thorough and in a sense fundamental, but that they require processes and time and hearing voices affected and so on?
I mean, I think in this came at a pretty bad time for Europe, right? So, or anywhere actually. So Donald is in the office. The UK is still in a mess with Brexit. I mean, we're still reeling from the migration crisis and a sort of tension in European collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. I think that it's been a tremendous stress test for democracy, particularly because countries with, how can I say this, less robust democratic traditions or more limited democracies have done much better in quelling the pandemic. You know, I mean, I don't think we need to ask about this. I think, you know, a command and control response has led to much lesser loss of lives and societal economic cost. But at the same time, you know, we believe in this system of governance. We believe that this is how we want to live our lives. We believe that, you know, citizens' individual freedom, social justice, you can't just trample on someone to save the majority. Things have processes. I think from the Norwegian perspective, it's been surprising to watch the lack of legal basis. You know, the willingness to just go on and on about regulations. And, you know, so just an anecdote, we're currently working on getting the government to adopt a legal basis for the second Smittestopp app. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to launch a new Smittestopp app in Norway. It's also going to be called Smittestopp. But it's launched by the Danish developer who made the Danish Smittestopp. But the Danes have a legal basis for their app. We don't. They don't want to have a legal basis. And I understand that bureaucrats are tired, but it's interesting that you can have things like a Corona hotel, for example, or all these things without having discussed this in Parliament. So I mean that's one thing I would like to see, at least here. It's more engagement by Parliament. And it's sort of unseemly to watch them bicker over sort of the Norwegian resettlement quota now, instead of discussing more pressing issues. I have to personally say. But again, you know, but I do think that, you know, I speak from a position of tremendous privilege. So I'm a government employee. I've been able to spend my year criticizing and speaking and writing about this. And I was never responsible for anything. So I think we should remember this as well. I think, I mean, part of why I got so engaged was when I wrote my first sort of critical post on Smittestopp, the developer of Smittestopp emailed me to tell me I was dishonest. They also told other people they were unpatriotic. And, you know, it's like a gift. You know, I got so angry and mobilized. But, you know, that type of language is very unhelpful. Some of you come from countries where activists are in grave danger. I mean, I've been working in Colombia, so has John. You know, that might cost you your life. And that's no small matter, right? So it's a little bit frivolous in a way to focus so much on Norway here. But these things are real.
Beth? I saw you had a comment in the chat function there, Beth. I wondered if you want to formulate that as a comment question.
I don't know if I can formulate a comment question. It was just something I was reading in the news. You know, about you were mentioning about the UK vaccine and the UK. We've done it first. We're amazing. And then you had Fauci come in. I think it was in the news this morning or last night. How yes, but the UK did it, but they're not as thorough as we are with the FDA. So it's like this imperial competition again of being like children bickering to win the game, and whoever wins, rather than actually it being about working. I'm sure it doesn't surprise anybody here, I'm sure, but rather than working together. I just thought that was the sense of childish competition imperialism that's existing within finding the vaccine.
On the other hand, I'm not, you know, I don't know enough about this, but I think it's a very interesting process what's going on, right? And I think at the moment, I'll find this. At the moment, UNICEF has a tender out for who will get sort of to be the vaccine provider. And with Pfizer, you know, their ultra cold chain. I've just put stuff in the chat of things we've been writing up on the ultra cold chain. So the ultra cold chain is just incredibly demanding. You know, you need to have things in 70 minus. It's unrealistic. But you know, all the monkey business going on in this procurement process, how do you trade off the goodness of a vaccine? You know, maybe the most marginal populations can get this one and they're somewhat protected. And I mean, it's usually a dirty game. At the same time, things are moving. We're having a debate. There is an initiative to sort of share costs. I mean, it's just a fascinating process. But I agree with you. It's odd that, you know, the bickering, but also the speed, you know, this idea of speed, you know, that you should accept a vaccine that might or might not be fully trialed, for example. Just, watching the Russian case with Sputnik and Putin refusing to take Sputnik. But how the world changes, right? So yesterday I read that, the former US presidents are providing leadership in wanting to inject their vaccines on TV. And it's of course Obama, it's Bill Clinton and George Bush. I mean, who would know that George Bush would become a pillar of global society? When we grew up, when we were 30, 20, he was the axis of evil, and now he seems like a pretty decent guy.
Bill, do you want to make a comment here? I saw you'd made a comment in the chat function, but maybe you also want to formulate a question.
Thanks so much, Kristin. One doesn't know where to begin with the amount of material that you've covered, but there was something about the whole way by which each country is responding. So I've been following South Africa and Zimbabwe, and of course, my home country. And in the US, it's brought the end of a presidency. It seems to me that COVID will do something that you were suggesting, that it would lead to really significant changes. But then again, it will be really tempered by the experience of each country and how the national leadership, how the political authorities responded to that. And so you get this enormous difference between Norway and Sweden. But on the other hand, the US, is just absolutely incredible. And I don't think I ever could have imagined the indifference and cruelty of the political leadership, but I don't think Trump and so on is alone. I think it's reproduced in India and other places. And so it seems like there's a whole arena of needed comparative research, which is political, social, health, and so on. And I'm not sure where and how justice and human rights have entered into nations' decision-making myself. Anyway, thanks again, Kristin, for a wonderful talk.
Great. Let's see, we have a question also from Mela.
Hi. Mine is, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it's great insight that you've just talked about, I don't know how to say your name, sorry, about all these data rights and the COVID pandemic. But I'm just thinking about it now because different countries are taking on different strategies, especially like in the South, and we see a lot of inequalities. And if you try to balance between the rights to an education, especially like with children, and data protection rights for those who are able to have education through the digital platforms, what's your take about it? What's the human rights perspective? Is it like a heavier burden to have the education through online platforms with the data privacy issues, or not be able to have a chance to have that education at all? How would you weigh in that,
So I think it's a tremendously good question. So I think it's the framing, that particular trade-off. I'm not sure that's the trade-off. It's usually being presented in that, right? So this relatively, who needs data protection if I'm hungry? I want to eat, I want my kids to eat. But the first is the notion that digital education is somehow free. It makes an enormous cut into a national educational budget, and it binds up and tweaks the national wiggling room a lot. And the worse contract you have, the more data extractiveness I think you can expect to find. So I would say that I acknowledge that it's a relevant dichotomy, but I don't think that's the dichotomy. And I think if we set that up, I do think it's a bad idea for children not to meet their teachers. They're kids. They shouldn't be sitting alone. And I think with the pandemic, we see children with parents, I mean, it's such a class difference in terms of equipment, connectivity, the ability to assist, and the time to assist. You know, a lot of poorer kids have families who are frontline workers. They need to be out there and earn their bread. So I do think that digital education is something we should really, really try to avoid. I mean, it's a supplement, but it's about to become the only show in town. And I do think that, I mean, there's a pretty racist discourse around data protection that I'm very uncomfortable with. And it ties up with data protection being something that rich and educated people should care about. And I think I disagree on this. I do think that, you know, it's part of children's rights to have their data protected, and also because we don't know where we're going. I mean, you know, in 10 years' time, you know, our children might be denied insurance because of some footage we're putting online now. We don't know, you know, as adults. And then all of you guys are sort of adults in the same boat as us. We don't know what this is going to mean for our kids. So I'm going to insist that, you know, we need to care for children's digital bodies, and for children in marginal context. I think that investment into education, it's a supplement, it's a great supplement, but it's a supplement.
If no one's, yeah, I just have a question for you, Chris, in this context of education. So obviously we've seen education in where it can be afforded to become very much more digitalized around the world in the countries that can afford it. You know, even between Norway and Canada, I'm Canadian, but I live in Norway. My nieces and nephews didn't have any digital education because they don't all have laptops, for example, you could say, the kids. But in Norway, the system had the ability to give each child, I think, predominantly a laptop for each child to go home with. But then do you really think that in time, I'm not talking about the near future, maybe in 20 years, that education will become fully digitalized and will stop actually having a school system in a sense? Like, I can imagine that happening in the future, but sometimes I wonder if you're speaking about it, something. Obviously, the pandemic has rushed that, like you said, it's been accelerating things. But do you see that as happening sooner than later?
I mean, I think it depends on where you're at, right? And what our struggles are going to be. So, you know, if we look at what can happen to us in terms of global health emergencies, COVID-19 is nothing. Any pandemic that doesn't make children and young people particularly sick is not a problem. If COVID-19 had specifically killed off people under 30, this would have been a completely different ballgame. So, you know, this was just nothing, to be honest, morally and ethically. I mean, of course, it's something, but, you know, children were not affected. I think it's partly what you can afford. I've been reading a horrible paper at some point that said Africans don't need roads, they need drones. I mean, you know, this is absolutely unacceptable, right? But it's expensive to build infrastructure. And people who sell technology would like their technology to bypass the costly process of educating teachers, giving them pedagogical tools, setting up schoolhouses, providing safe and secure environments for kids, and particularly rural areas across the world, not only in developing countries, will be marginalized by digital tools. It's going to be much easier to just say, you know, this is coverage. I think we see this in a lot of areas. I mean, in Norway, we have decentralization reform where, you know, people aren't allowed to give birth because there isn't a local hospital anymore. And of course, for wealthy areas, next health scare, I'm sure we're going to lock down in the split of a second, and everyone is going to have sort of fancy gadgets. And education, access to education is going to be tiered according to connectivity and of course the platforms you're able to afford. But I just worry about sort of the unwillingness to invest.
So you see it more in the context become more digitalized because the state will want to, because the less investment they have to make into education because it becomes,
I can see that. There are clearly some stakeholders who will benefit enormously from that development.
Yeah, it's happening in Mexico. I lived there many years, and I know, for example, all the schools there are shut down, and they had this whole thing about, don't worry, we're going to put it all digitally. But then they realized after, wait, we can't because not everyone has computers, obviously, in Mexico. How could you not? How did you take time to realize that? Then they put it on television instead. But then again, you know, I don't think a large percentage of people that don't have television. The town I live, there used to be one TV. Well, now it's changed a bit, but 10 years ago, there was kind of, you know, a few taquerias that had a TV where you could sit and watch TV every day. So the access is still unequal, but they promote it. The government, the state is like, we're doing it, but they're not really doing it.
Yeah. So, but also I think the part of this is, you know, how we've been securitizing COVID-19 as the worst thing that can happen. So in a lot of these countries, you know, what about reproductive health, maternal deaths, deaths of people under 5 years old, treatable diseases that are now going to be under prioritized because due to global migration, the West needs everyone to be vaccinated. And I'm sure there's an incentive to create vaccines that need to be injected several times, for example. And so there's a forcing of resources. And towards all kinds of new structures and institutions and actors. And I'm concerned. And I think Bill is right. Every country needs to have its own narrative around this, but we do need to pay very critical attention.
Kristin, I don't see any other questions coming up, but I think one of the questions I'd like to ask you is, I mean, we have a group of young scholars here who may be interested in looking into these issues further. Where should they look? Are there particular organizations here in Norway, but also perhaps more broadly speaking across the world, that we should be paying attention to?
In terms of?
In terms of organizations that are following these developments, in terms of you know, the digitalization of our lives, the questions around justice and digitalization and digital bodies.
So of course there are a couple of very good listservs. I mean, I can write this up for you, but you know, responsible data. There are critical communities in the humanitarian field, in the development field, in the human rights field. And increasingly they are coming together to organize and articulate their viewpoints and also push for new rights. And then of course there's a scholarly field. So this is going to be quaint, but for example, in the field of neuroscience and the law, you know, there are people working towards new human rights, for example, the right to continuous memory. So I mean, it's a very vibrant field of sort of data justice, and I'm happy to provide links. And then it's a very exciting development, and we're lucky to have also good people in Oslo who's been writing about this from the perspective of the global South, but also the perspective of the global East. And I do think that the global East is a concept we need to work with as a kind of a parallel to the global North in terms of being extractive and being subjected to too little criticism.
So the global East here, you mean, is kind of an Orientalist?
I mean, the way sort of huge Chinese and Indian actors do data governance, extract data, accumulate resources, but are not subjected to the same kind of criticism that we levy against Facebook and Twitter and Amazon and Google. There simply isn't a global critical front that's holding these actors to task. And they never sit around the table because, and mostly some Indians, but no Chinese actors in kind of the global meetings I attend. So I know there's a lot of diplomatic work going on, but I do think also there is something slightly ethnocentric about also not one engaged, right? So I do think that we need to open the space for participants, for diversity in who gets a voice, but also diversity in who gets criticized, to be honest. I've just been spending a week of robot regulation exams, and it's a class where we ask the students to make movies. I mean, they make amazing movies on facial recognition, on remote biometrics, on AI in courts, on the black box of medicine, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, the example that keeps showing up again and again and again is how biometric technology disproportionately targets African Americans in an unfair way. And nothing about 1 million Uyghurs in camps and you know, how we do digital surveillance. It's also because it would create a very dangerous context for our Chinese students if that was discussed in the class. But I think it's something that we as educators need to be tougher in thinking about.
Indeed.
Mm.
Any further questions? Final questions?
And thank you guys for inviting me, and thank you for engaging. I'm happy to circulate the manuscript once I can slot some footnotes on it.
That would be great, Kristin. So we thank you very much. It's been really great having you with us today. Thank you very much for your rich presentation. We follow your work, so it's been a great pleasure. Thank you also all for the others attending, all students and staff attending. So thanks, and I hope to see you guys later. Yeah.
Thank you.
For now, it's early days yet, but have a happy Christmas, Kristin, when you get there.
And safe to all of you. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.